Mary Poppins, Chapter 8, Mrs. Corrie. 2 pounds of sausages, best pork, said Mary Poppins, and at once, please, we're in a hurry. The butcher, who wore a large blue and white striped apron, was a fat and friendly man. He was also large and red, and rather like one of his own sausages. He leant upon his chopping block and gazed admiringly at Mary Poppins. Then he winked pleasantly at Jane and Michael. "In a hurry?" he said to Mary Poppins. "Well, that's a pity. I hope you'd be in for a bit of a chat. We butchers, you know, we like a bit of company. And we don't often get the chance to talk to a nice, handsome young lady like you." He broke off suddenly, for he had caught sight of Mary Poppins' face. The expression on it was awful, and the butcher found himself wishing there was a trap door in the floor of his shop that would open and swallow him up. "Oh, well," he said, blushing even redder than usual, "if you're in a hurry, of course. 2 pounds, d'ye say? Best pork, right you are." And he hurriedly hooked down a long strip of the sausages that were festooned across the shop. He cut off a length about 3/4 of a yard, wound it into a sort of garland, wrapped it first in white and then in brown paper. He pushed the parcel across the chopping block. "And the next?" he said hopefully, still blushing. "There will be no next," said Mary Poppins with a haughty sniff. And she took the sausages and turned the pram around very quickly and wheeled it out of the shop in such a way that the butcher knew he had mortally offended her. But she glanced at the window as she went, so she could see how her new shoes looked reflected in it. They were bright brown kid with 2 buttons, very smart. Jane and Michael trailed after her, wondering when she would come to the end of her shopping list, but because of the look on her face, not daring to ask her. Mary Poppins gazed up and down the street as if deep in thought, and then suddenly making up her mind, she snapped her fingers and said, "Fishmonger," and turned the pram into the shop next to the butcher's. "$1 or so, £1.50 of halibut, pint of prawns and a lobster," said Mary Poppins, talking so quickly that only somebody used to taking such orders could possibly have understood her. The fishmonger, unlike the butcher, was a long, thin man, so thin that he seemed to have no front to him, but only 2 sides. And he looked so sad that you felt he'd either just been weeping or was just going to. Jane said this was due to some secret sorrow that had haunted him since his youth. Michael thought that the fishmonger's mother must have fed him entirely on bread and water when he was a baby, and that he'd never forgotten it. "Anything else?" said the fishmonger helplessly, in a voice that suggested he was quite sure there wouldn't be. "Not today," said Mary Poppins. The fishmonger shook his head sadly and did not look at all surprised. He'd known all along there would be nothing else. Sniffing gently, he tied up the parcel and dropped it into the pram. "Bad weather," he observed, wiping his eye with his hand. "Don't believe we're going to get any summer at all. Not that we ever did, of course. You don't look too blooming," he said to Mary Poppins. "But then, nobody does." Mary Poppins tossed her head. "Speak for yourself," she said crossly, and flounced to the door, pushing the pram so fiercely that it bumped into a bag of oysters. "The idea!" Jane and Michael heard her say as she glanced down at her shoes. "Not looking too blooming in her new brown kid shoes with 2 buttons? The idea!" That was what they heard her thinking. Outside on the pavement, she paused, looking at her list and ticking off what she had bought. Michael stood first on one leg and then on the other. "Mary Poppins, are we never going home?" he said crossly. Mary Poppins turned and regarded him with something like disgust. "That," she said, "is as it may be." And Michael, watching her fold up her list, wished he'd not spoken. "You can go home if you like. We are going to buy gingerbread." Michael's face fell. If only he had managed to say nothing. He hadn't known that gingerbread was at the end of the list. "That's your way," said Mary Poppins shortly, pointing in the direction of Cherry Tree Lane. "If you don't get lost," she added as an afterthought. "Oh, no, Mary Poppins, please, no, I didn't mean it, really, Oh, Mary Poppins, please," cried Michael. "Do let him come, Mary Poppins," said Jane. "I'll push the pram if only you'll let him come." Mary Poppins sniffed. "If it wasn't Friday," she said darkly to Michael, "you'd go home in a twink, in an absolute twink." She moved onwards, pushing John and Barbara. Jane and Michael knew that she had relented and followed, wondering what a twink was. Suddenly Jane noticed they were going in the wrong direction. "But, Mary Poppins, I thought you said gingerbread. This isn't the way to Green, Brown and Johnson's, where we always get it," she began, and stopped because of Mary Poppins' face. "Am I doing the shopping, or are you?" Mary Poppins inquired. "You?" said Jane in a small voice. "Oh, really? I thought it was the other way round." She gave the pram a little twist with her hand, and it turned a corner and drew up suddenly. Jane and Michael, stopping abruptly behind it, found themselves outside the most curious shop they had ever seen. It was very small and very dingy. Faded loops of coloured paper hung in the windows, and on the shelves were shabby little boxes of sherbet, old licorice sticks, and very withered, very hard apples on a stick. There was a small dark doorway between the windows, and through this Mary Poppins propelled the pram while Jane and Michael followed at her heels. Inside the shop they could see dimly the glass-topped counter that ran round three sides of it, and in a case under the glass were rows and rows of dark, dry gingerbread, each slab so studded with gilt stars that the shop itself seemed to be faintly lit by them. Jane and Michael glanced round to find out what kind of person was to serve them, and were very surprised when Mary Poppins called out, "Fanny, Annie, where are you?" Her voice seemed to echo back to them from each dark wall of the shop. And as she called, two of the largest people the children had ever seen rose from behind the counter and shook hands with Mary Poppins. The huge woman then leant down over the counter and said, "Howdy do," in voices as large as themselves, and shook hands with Jane and Michael. "Well, how do you do, miss?" Michael paused, wondering which of the large ladies was which. "Fanny's the name," said one of them. "It's a lovely day," began Jane politely to the other sister, who kept Jane's hand imprisoned for almost a minute in her huge clasp. "I'm Annie," she informed them miserably. Jane and Michael thought that both sisters had a very odd way of expressing themselves, but they had not time to be surprised for long, for Miss Fanny and Miss Annie were reaching out their long arms to the pram. Each shook hands solemnly with one of the twins, who were so astonished that they began to cry. Now, what's this? What's this?" A high, thin, crackly voice came from the back of the shop. At the sound of it, the expression on the faces of Miss Fanny and Miss Annie, sad before, became even sadder. They seemed frightened and ill at ease, and somehow Jane and Michael realised that the two huge sisters were wishing they were much smaller and much less conspicuous. "What is all this I hear?" cried a curious high little voice, coming nearer, and presently, round the corner of the glass case, the owner of it appeared. She was as small as her voice, and as crackly, and to the children she seemed to be older than anything in the world, with her wispy hair and her stick-like legs and her wizened, wrinkled little face. But in spite of this, she ran towards them as lightly and as gaily as though she was still a young girl. Now, I do declare, bless me if it isn't Mary Poppins with John and Barbara Banks. What, Jane and Michael too? Well, isn't this a nice surprise for me? I assure you, I haven't been so surprised since Christopher Columbus discovered America. Truly, I haven't." She smiled delightfully as she came to greet them, and her feet made little dancing movements inside the tiny elastic-side boots. She ran to the pram and rocked it gently, crooking her thin, twisted old fingers at John and Barbara until they stopped crying and began to laugh. "That's better," she said. Then she did a very odd thing. She broke off 2 of her fingers and gave 1 each to John and Barbara. And the oddest part of it was that in the space left by the broken off fingers, 2 new ones grew at once. Jane and Michael saw it happen. "Only barley sugar, can't possibly hurt 'em," said the old lady. "Anything you give them, Mrs. Corrie, could only do them good," said Mary Poppins with surprising courtesy. "What a pity," Michael couldn't help saying, "they weren't peppermint bars." "Well, they are sometimes," said Mrs. Corrie gleefully, "and very good they taste too. I often nibble 'em myself if I can't sleep at night. Splendid for the digestion." "What will they be next time?" asked Jane, looking at Mrs. Corrie's fingers with interest. "Aha!" said Mrs. Corrie. "That's just the question. I never know from day to day what they will be. I take the chance, my dear, as I heard William the Conqueror say to his mother when she advised him not to go conquering England." "You must be very old," said Jane, sighing enviously, and wondering if she would ever be able to remember what Mrs. Corrie remembered. Mrs. Corrie flung back her little head and shrieked with laughter. "Old?" she said. "Why, I'm quite a chicken compared to my grandmother. Now there's an old woman if you like. Still, I go a good way back. I remember a time when you were making this world anyway, and I was well out of my teens then. My goodness, that was a to-do, I can tell you." She broke off suddenly, screwing up her little eyes at the children. "But dearie me, here am I running on, and you not being served. I suppose, my dear," she turned to Mary Poppins, whom she appeared to know very well, "I suppose you've come for some gingerbread." "That's right, Mrs. Corrie," said Mary Poppins politely. "Good. Have Fanny and Annie given you any?" She looked at Jane and Michael as she said this. Jane shook her head. 2 hushed voices came from behind the counter. "No, Mother," said Miss Fanny meekly. "We were just going to, Mother," began Annie in a frightened whisper. At that, Mrs. Corrie drew herself up to her full height and regarded her gigantic daughters furiously, and then she said in a soft, fierce, terrifying voice, "Just going to? Oh, indeed! That is very interesting. And who, may I ask, Annie, gave you permission to give away my gingerbread?" "Nobody, Mother, and I didn't give it away. I only thought—" "You only thought? That's very kind of you. But I will thank you not to think. I can do all the thinking that is necessary here," said Miss Corrie in her soft, terrible voice. Then she burst into a harsh cackle of laughter. "Look at her! Just look at her! Cowardy custard crybaby!" she shrieked, pointing her knotty finger at her daughter. Jane and Michael turned and saw a large tear coursing down Miss Annie's huge, sad face. But they didn't like to say anything, for in spite of her tinniness, Mrs. Corrie made them feel rather small and frightened. But as soon as Mrs. Corrie looked the other way, Jane seized the opportunity to offer Miss Annie her handkerchief. The huge tear completely drenched it, and Miss Annie, with a grateful look, wrung it out before she returned it to Jane. "And you, Fanny, did you think too, I wonder?" The little high voice was now directed at the other daughter. "No, Mother," said Miss Fanny, trembling. Just as well for you. Open that case." With frightened, fumbling fingers, Miss Fanny opened the glass case. "Now, my darlings," said Mrs. Corrie in quite a different voice. She smiled and beckoned so sweetly to Jane and Michael that they were ashamed of having been frightened of her and felt that she must be very nice after all. "Won't you come and take your pick, my lambs? It's a special recipe today, one I got from Alfred the Great. He was a very good cook, I remember, though he did once burn the cakes. How many?" Jane and Michael looked at Mary Poppins. 4 each, she said. That's 12, 1 dozen. I'll make it a baker's dozen. Take 13, said Mrs. Corry cheerfully. So Jane and Michael chose 13 slabs of gingerbread, each with its gilt paper star. Their arms were piled up with the delicious dark cakes. Michael couldn't resist nibbling a corner of one of them. Good, squeaked Mrs. Corry, and when he nodded, she picked up her skirts and did a few steps of the Highland fling for pure pleasure. Hooray, hooray, splendid, hooray, she cried in her shrill little voice. Then she came to a standstill and her face grew serious. But remember, I'm not giving them away. I must be paid. The price is 3p for each of you. Mary Poppins opened her purse and took out 3 threepenny bits. She gave one each to Jane and Michael. Now, said Mrs. Corry, stick 'em on my coat. That's where they all go. They looked closely at her long black coat, and sure enough they found it was studded with threepenny bits, as a coster's coat is with pearl buttons. Come on, stick 'em on, repeated Mrs. Corry, rubbing her hands with pleasant expectation. You'll find they won't drop off. Mary Poppins stepped forward and pressed her threepenny bit against the collar of Mrs. Corry's coat. To the surprise of Jane and Michael, it stuck. Then they put theirs on, Jane's on the right shoulder and Michael's on the front hem. Theirs stuck too. How very extraordinary, said Jane. Not at all, my dear, said Mrs. Corry, or rather not so extraordinary as other things I could mention, and she winked at Mary Poppins. I'm afraid we must be off now, Mrs. Corry, said Mary Poppins. There's baked custard for lunch, and I must be home in time to make it. That Mrs. Brill. A poor cook? Inquired Mrs. Corry, interrupting. Poor? Said Mary Poppins contemptuously. That's not the word. Mrs. Corry put her finger alongside her nose and looked very wise. And then she said, Well, my dear Mary Poppins, it's been a very pleasant visit, and I'm sure my girls have enjoyed it as much as I have. She nodded in the direction of her 2 large, mournful daughters. And you'll come again soon, won't you, with Jane and Michael and the babies? Now, are you sure you can carry the gingerbread? She continued, turning to Michael and Jane. They nodded. Mrs. Corry drew closer to them, and with a curious, important, inquisitive look on her face. I wonder, she said dreamily, what you will do with the paper stars. Oh, we'll keep them, said Jane. We always do. Ah, you keep them. And I wonder where you keep them. Mrs. Corry's eyes were half closed and she looked more inquisitive than ever. Well, said Jane, mine are all under my handkerchiefs in the top left-hand drawer, and mine are in the shoebox on the bottom shelf of the wardrobe, said Michael. Top left-hand drawer and shoebox in the wardrobe, said Mrs. Corry thoughtfully, as though she were committing the words to memory. And then she gave Mary Poppins a long look and nodded her head slightly. Mary Poppins nodded slightly in return. It seemed as though some secret had passed between them. Well, said Mrs. Corry, that's very interesting. I don't know how glad I am to know you keep where you keep your stars. I shall remember that. You see, I remember everything, even what Guy Fawkes had for dinner every second Sunday. And now, goodbye. Come again soon. Come again soon. Mrs. Corry's voice seemed to grow fainter and faded away, and presently, without being quite aware of what had happened, Jane and Michael found themselves on the pavement, walking behind Mary Poppins, who was again examining her list. They turned and looked behind them. Why, Jane, said Michael with a look, it's not there. So I see, said Jane, staring and staring. And they were right. The shop was not there. It had entirely disappeared. How odd, said Jane. Isn't it? Said Michael. But the gingerbread is very good. And they were so busy biting their gingerbread into different shapes, a man, a flower, a teapot, that they quite forgot how very odd it was. They remembered it again that night, though, when the lights were out and they were both supposed to be sound asleep. "Jane! Jane!" whispered Michael. "I hear someone tiptoeing on the stairs. Listen!" "Shh!" hissed Jane from her bed, for she too had heard the footsteps. Presently the door opened with a little click and somebody came into the room. It was Mary Poppins, dressed in a coat and hat, all ready to go out. She moved about the room softly with quick, secret movements. Jane and Michael watched her through half-closed eyes without stirring. First, she went to the chest of drawers, opened a drawer and shut it after a moment. Then, on tiptoe, she went to the wardrobe, opened it, bent down, and put something in or took something out. They couldn't tell which. Snap! The wardrobe door shut quickly, and Mary Poppins hurried from the room. Michael sat up in bed. "What was she doing?" he said to Jane in a loud whisper. "I don't know. Perhaps she's forgotten her gloves or her shoes or—" Jane broke off suddenly. "Michael, listen!" He listened. From down below in the garden, it seemed they could hear several voices whispering together very earnestly and excitedly. With a quick movement, Jane got out of bed and beckoned Michael. They crept on bare feet to the window and looked down. There outside in the lane stood a tiny form and two gigantic figures. "Mrs. Corrie and Miss Fanny and Miss Annie," said Jane in a whisper. And so indeed it was. It was a curious group. Mrs. Corrie was looking through the bars of the gate of number 17. Miss Fanny had two long ladders balanced on one huge shoulder, while Miss Annie appeared to be carrying in one hand a large pail of something that looked like glue, and in the other an enormous paintbrush. From where they stood, hidden by the curtain, Jane and Michael could distinctly hear their voices. "She's late," Mrs. Corrie was saying crossly and anxiously. "Perhaps," Miss Fanny began timidly, settling the ladders more firmly on her shoulder, "one of the children is ill and she couldn't get away in time," said Miss Annie, nervously completing her sister's sentence. "Silence!" said Mrs. Corrie fiercely, and Jane and Michael distinctly heard her whisper something about great galumphing giraffes, and they knew she was referring to her unfortunate daughters. "Hist!" said Mrs. Corrie suddenly, listening with her head on one side like a small bird. There was the sound of the front door being quietly opened and shut again, and the creak of footsteps on the path. Mrs. Corrie smiled and waved her hand as Mary Poppins came to meet them, carrying a basket in her arm, and in the basket there was something that seemed to give out a faint, mysterious light. Come along, we must hurry. We haven't much time," said Mrs. Corrie, taking Mary Poppins by the arm. "Look lively, you two." And she moved off, followed by Miss Fanny and Miss Annie, who were obviously trying to look as lively as possible, but not succeeding very well. They tramped heavily after their mother and Mary Poppins, bending under their loads. Jane and Michael saw all four of them go down Cherry Tree Lane, and then they turned a little to the left and went up the hill. When they got to the top of the hill, where there were no houses but only grass and clover, they stopped. Miss Annie put down her pail of glue, and Miss Fanny swung the ladders from her shoulder and steadied them until both stood in an upright position. Then she held one and Miss Annie held the other. "What on earth are they going to do?" said Michael. But there was no need for Jane to reply, for he could see for himself what was happening. As soon as Miss Fanny and Miss Annie had so fixed the ladders that they seemed to be standing with one end on the earth and the other leaning onto the sky, Mrs. Corrie picked up her skirts and the paintbrush in one hand and the pail of glue in the other. Then she set her foot on the lowest rung of one of the ladders and began to climb it. Mary Poppins, carrying her basket, climbed the other. Then Jane and Michael saw a most amazing sight. As soon as she arrived at the top of her ladder, Mrs. Corey dipped her brush into the glue and began slapping the sticky substance against the sky. And Mary Poppins, when this had been done, took something shiny from her basket and fixed it to the glue. When she took her hand away, they saw that she was sticking the gingerbread stars to the sky. As each one was placed in position, it began to twinkle furiously, sending out rays of sparkling golden light. "They're ours," said Michael breathlessly. "They're our stars. She thought we were asleep and came in and took them." But Jane was silent. She was watching Mrs. Corey splashing the glue on the sky, and Mary Poppins sticking on the stars, and Miss Fanny and Miss Annie moving the ladders to a new position as the spaces in the sky became filled up. At last it was over. Mary Poppins shook out her basket and showed Mrs. Corey there was nothing left in it. Then they came down from the ladders, and the procession started down the hill again. Miss Fanny shouldering the ladders, Miss Annie jangling her empty glue pail. At the corner they stood for a moment. Then Mary Poppins shook hands with them all and hurried up the lane again. Mrs. Corey, dancing lightly in her elastic-sided boots and holding her skirts daintily with her hands, disappeared in the other direction with her huge daughters stumping noisily behind her. The garden gate clicked. Footsteps creaked on the path. The front door opened and shut with a huge clanging sound. Presently they heard Mary Poppins come quietly up the stairs, tiptoe past the nursery, and go on into the room where she slept with John and Barbara. As the sound of her footsteps died away, Jane and Michael looked at each other. Then without a word they went together to the top left-hand drawer and looked. There was nothing there but a pile of Jane's handkerchiefs. "I told you so," said Michael. Next they went to the wardrobe and looked in the shoebox. It was empty. "But how and why?" said Michael, sitting down on the edge of his bed, staring at Jane. Jane said nothing. She just sat beside him with her arms round her knees and thought and thought and thought. At last she shook back her hair and stretched herself up and stood. "What I want to know," she said, "is this. Are the stars gold paper, or is the gold paper stars?" There was no reply to her question, and she did not expect one. She knew that only somebody very much wiser than Michael could give her the right answer.